Dear Lord, we thank you so much for these Sabbath hours. We thank you for the messages that we have been studying, for the unlearning that we each have been doing. And we pray that as we come before you this evening and that we come together, that you would help us to have humble and contrite spirits, to search deeply within ourselves, and to continue to understand just how deeply 6,000 years of sexism runs. We pray that you would help us to be of one heart and one mind, to understand, to see clearly, and to be truly united in our search for the truth. We thank you for your patience towards us as we learn. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. It's been 2 weeks. So there has been a gap. I don't want to spend much time on review though, because our last class 2 weeks ago was mostly review. I wanted to, on the board behind us, just try to illustrate what we were doing, that we took Max as a representative of a large segment of society, especially the portion of society most prone to ending up in the far right, most problematic to the messages of equality, and show how he developed his views and also just what his views fundamentally are, the three components, the Trinity. So just to remind, if you want to speak, please put a H in the chat so we can remember all of our method of operating. A H in the chat will, for me, indicate that there is a hand raised. So just to remember, happy to have dialogue, but if you can just raise your hand if you would like to. So I wanted to show Max as an example of a large group in society, which is exactly what the article was doing. They'd seen this broad segment and they had found someone in that portion of society willing to elaborate on the views that this portion of society has. And they broke it down to that Trinity doctrine. So we wanted to ask why does Max, the Maxes, have that worldview? Why do they have this belief, a strong belief in atheism, men's rights, and libertarianism? And it isn't that Max was somehow born with a brain that's just inherently more logical, more reasonable than everyone else's brains. Like everyone else, he is developing his worldview from a source. So we wanted to look at the source. Now, the source is clearly not a Christian one. It's clearly not a religious one. So we went and looked at the Mount Rushmore, the influences of they predated that. You could say post-1989 atheism, if we want to keep a prophetic model, particularly finding their voices after 9/11. So we looked at those influences of modern atheism and evolution. And we put Max here with that collection of doctrines, and then we moved it upwards to see the influence that someone like Max is coming under over the last 20-25 years. Remember, when we're discussing Max, and we're also looking at this in the context of Gamergate, we're not talking about men in their 60s, 70s, 80s. We're talking about someone in their 20s and 30s, particularly, and also around the middle age. But someone going through the 90s, going through 9/11, and developing their worldview through particularly the decade of the 2000s. where you hear the rising voices of the four horsemen, Harris, Dawkins, Hitchens, and Dennett. So in the last class that we had, I wanted to make the point that they are not just proponents of atheism, they are also the proponents of men's rights and libertarianism. So we went further into things that Dawkins has espoused and Hitchens has espoused, particularly Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, to show that not only are they the voices of modern atheism, they also embody libertarianism and men's rights activism, which would make logical sense, because if Max has all of these views and they come in that kind of package, then they're coming packaged from somewhere else as well. So we went through various arguments that these four men made. We saw that Hitchens makes the point that civil rights, especially in relation to gender, were completed in 1968, and everything since then, and the concept of the personal is political, is rubbish. We saw him make arguments about how men are the oppressed in society. The other men certainly gave sympathy to that view, but he stated it emphatically. Dawkins hinted at feminism being a religion, and all of them promulgate that idea that men and women have intrinsic strengths and weaknesses. That association to social Darwinism and what is more popularly called psychological evolution. First tenet of social Darwinism, the belief that people have intrinsic abilities and talents and correspondingly intrinsic weaknesses. For these men, misogyny is not based in religion at all, but in biology. I do want to make the point that I agree with them. I agree when they say they have reason and rationality on their side, if we agree to the concept of evolution to begin with. I want to explain what I mean. Remember how the concept of stratifying the races by intelligence developed within evolution. They said that evolution could be seen through the development of language, and because you had all these different languages, then people evolved, or nations, clans, groups of people, countries, these all evolved separately. And if an Indigenous person in Australia is evolving from an animal in a completely separately and independently to someone, say in modern Spain, then they're going to evolve differently, not just in body, but in thought, in brain, in intelligence. They're both evolving from an animal source, but they have to evolve into not just different factions, but just about into a completely different being. And that being isn't rational to suggest there's going to be intrinsic psychological differences between an Indigenous Australian and someone evolving in Europe. And then it only becomes logical to start stratifying them by intelligence. Their position is a rational one, a logical one, if you agree to this fundamental component of Darwinism. And then when they look at Indigenous Australians and see that the community here had no written language, only a spoken language, then they're going to develop the idea that because language is like the metric by which they are measuring how far the evolutionary process has taken a group of people, they're going to look at Indigenous Australians as virtually the lowest on that chain because they didn't have a written language. So that there is a reasonableness and rationality to not just what Darwin quickly entered into. Darwin, his cousin, the scientific community of Germany, which did not end well. There's a rationality to that, but there's also, it hasn't gone away, as we know through the book released, I think, in 1994, and then how Harris, particularly Sam Harris, has continued to give airtime to what developed in the 1800s with Darwin. It's not a new concept. It has become increasingly unpopular to do this with race, but it is still incredibly popular to do this with gender. And I think that the articles, not just the one from the Scientific American, but the Vox article I shared, they make that point quite well. When they say that they are not trying to be racist, just being rational, logical, having scientific debate, if that is the basis of your modern science, then I would argue they're right. It's rational. I don't agree, though, with its underlying premise that we evolved separately from an animal species. Separate evolutionary chain for the races. Separate evolutionary chain for men and women. Even though they're intermingling, they're pushed into different structures within society, and men hunting, fighting, politics, debate. Darwin said it best. Men ultimately became superior to women. They had to, because they were evolving in different environments. So we'll go to the article, the Scientific American. I'm just going to read a few bits from it and then check and encourage people to comment. That article goes into how Charles Darwin and the scientists surrounding him, embracing psychological evolution, social Darwinism, built that into a model of sexism, which he says hardened sexism into something that couldn't even be challenged because they made it inherent, they made it biological. Evolutionary psychology, a modern instantiation of Darwinian theory, still provides justification for female inequality. And then he gives recent examples of how this continues widely today, popularly today. A 2000 book, The Mating Mind, How Sexual Choice Shaped the Evolution of Human Nature. Evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller writes, men write more books, men give more lectures, men ask more questions after lectures, men dominate mixed sex committee discussions. I just want to comment there. I remember when Elder Parminder came to Australia in 2017, and I remember when he would finish teaching or when we would gather before a mealtime, and the men of the movement would gather around him like a circle to see what he was saying. And I remember very clearly the battle in my own mind. There was no women that gathered around him. The women would go off together, or they would go into the kitchen, they would be cleaning, they would be packing up, they would be with children. The women didn't cling to him. And the battle in my mind was not that I couldn't. The battle in my mind was the social pressure of being the only woman in that group, going up, pushing closer to hear what he was saying when he wasn't presenting, when there were these private discussions. And women missed out on that, not because they didn't want to ask questions after Elder Parminder taught, but because of the social pressure, because of the feeling that when you would go up, that you would be looked at in a certain way. And there was that look like, what are you doing here? Are you trying to find a boyfriend? You're out of place. That was palpable in the room. And that was why I did go up, but it was an internal intellectual fight against the way that going up made me feel vulnerable, afraid, alone. Men write more books, men give more lectures. Yes, they do. But I can't prove it through a scientific formula for these evolutionary psychologists. Again, it's experiential. These behavioural differences reflect biological differences, Miller argues. So they're saying this reason that primarily the men of the movement gathered around Elder Parminder, whereas the women would find themselves useful in other ways. They're arguing, evolutionary psychologists argue that that is biological. Experience tells you it's not. Natural selection made males more aggressive in their pursuit of status than females. Hunter-gatherer societies, though, they say were remarkably egalitarian. Then they go into the Google memo that James Damore released, and that's what I wanted to bring up with the Vox article, to make some very specific points. Does anyone have anything they want to say on the Scientific American article? Anything they learnt from that or that stood out more clearly? I'll continue then and just make a couple of points from what I shared this afternoon. In this article for Google, James Damore makes the claim that the reason that women are underrepresented at Google and other tech firms is because of their biological differences, and therefore efforts to bring more women into tech are misguided. And what I wanted to do, and something that I think I want to discuss in more detail, is how we view arguments like that. What I did was, when I read in that article that he said an evolutionary psychologist, in fact quite a number of evolutionary psychologists came out in defense of Damore, I went to see what the evolutionary psychologists had to say. One of those evolutionary psychologists wrote an article for the New York Times. His name is David Brooks. And what David Brooks says in defense of Damore's memo is that Damore, the Google employee who wrote the memo, Damore was tapping into the long and contentious debate about genes and behaviour. On one side, so he's going to make two sides. He's going to say, over here is Damore and evolutionary psychologists. On one side are those who believe that humans came out as blank slates and are formed by social structures. On the other side are the evolutionary psychologists who argue that genes interact with environment and genes play a large role in shaping who we are. He says, in general, the evolutionary psychologists have been winning this debate. So he thinks they're winning. And over this side, you have, I don't want to just put feminists, I'm going to put Gina Rippon. Because it's not just feminists. It is perhaps a minority within science, but a group within science. He quotes other scientists. Deborah So wrote in the Globe and Mail in Toronto, despite how it's been portrayed, the memo was fair and factually accurate. Geoffrey Miller and other evolutionary psychologists wrote in the Quillette, for what it's worth, I think that almost all of the Google memo's empirical claims are scientifically accurate. What we have is a legitimate tension. Damore is describing truth on one level, His sensible critics are describing a different truth. One that exists on another level. Daymore is championing scientific research They are championing gender equality. It takes a little subtlety to harmonize these strands. It takes subtlety to harmonize gender equality with the scientific research, but it is doable. He says it's hard. It's hard, you have to be subtle about it, but you can harmonize gender equality with the research. But he says that Google's diversity officer, Daniela Brown, when she said that these are incorrect assumptions about gender, he says this is ideology. Obliterating reason. So I shared the Vox article to give a little bit more of a rounded perspective of what was in that memo and the problems with that memo. But what I wanted to take out of it is that this fight over the gendered brain is not one that the scientific community has consensus on. It's an ongoing war. On one side, you have The Gendered Brain by Gina Rippon. On one side, you have those who are arguing for gender equality and trying to call science out for how their bias has misused research and data. And on the other side, you have the descendants of Darwin, the descendants of social Darwinism and psychological evolution, the same arguments that were used for race but are still have not lost their popularity when it comes to gender. But I wanted us to see how these arguments get packaged. Many defenders seem genuinely baffled that a document that works so hard to appear dispassionate, reasonable, could provoke such an emotional response. Note that these are just average differences, the manifesto reiterates. Defense. Gender differences are just average. Doesn't apply to every woman. You might be one of the special ones that are more rational than all the others. Soothingly, there's some overlap between men and women. Here again, this studiously dispassionate and showy air of reasonableness create cover for the memo's defenders. Reasonable again. It keeps coming up because those who are making this argument and those who are fighting this argument know what the defenses of it are. Reason, reasonable, dispassionate, scientific research, truth on a rational level. The author of that Vox article, a man on Twitter, responded to what she had to say by saying it was irrational for any one woman to take offence at a discussion of women's characteristics on average. Because you take this side and you know what you're going to be accused of. Many defenders of the manifesto have eagerly, and as far as I can tell, earnestly pointed me to the manifesto writer's frequent claims to support diversity in the abstract, as if these are supposed to be reassuring. I value diversity and inclusion and am not denying that sexism exists. So this side will say we don't deny sexism, We are feminist. But that doesn't make their arguments or how their arguments are used any less dangerous. It wouldn't on race and it doesn't on gender. Going to assume everyone read the Scientific American article. I'm not sure if everyone read the Vox article. But Marie, from the Scientific American, do you see the two sides, how there is this fight within the scientific community?
Yes, yes, I do.
Do you want to describe any of it in your own words?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit blank at the moment.
That's fine. It might settle in with time. Anyone else? Has anyone read the Vox article that was posted this afternoon? Is there time for that? Some haven't had time yet. Graham?
Sorry, I was just responding that I
Graham,
did read the article that you posted today.
Thank you. I understand. If you have. I wanted to show how, and this is a brilliant book, she makes a scientific argument, but it is not one that many people, even within the scientific community, believe is rational or reasonable. And I want us to know that when we hold to this position, that we are fighting a large amount of the scientific community. And this is where that argument has developed through psychological, social Darwinism. They keep saying themselves, they reference themselves as evolutionary psychologists. They've taken that component from Darwinism to argue about these intrinsic differences. And that's something that the author of the article of the Scientific American, that's something Gina Rippon is very well aware of, that they are fighting these centuries of damaging stereotypes that were so solidified by the concept of evolution that they have made sexism so much harder to uproot. So that's dealing with this, seeing how social Darwinism, I'm going to refer to it as psychological evolution. I don't believe, by the way, that people have rid themselves of this in the context of race. What has happened is they are less likely to want to talk about it, except for those who find themselves or consider themselves to be the most brave. But it is still very much there. When it comes to gender, though, it's a free-for-all. I wanted to show how Max developed his worldview, which comes from the people that he spent the 2000s particularly listening to, and where they get their, not all of their sexism, but a lot of the defenses for their sexism from, and it's directly connected to their atheism, coming back down to Darwin. The final piece that was meant to be our review was to take us over here. To Roy den Hollander. What you have when you have men's rights taken to its most logical conclusion. He embodies all of these arguments. He says gender equality for women is not an issue. There is no gender equality lacking for women. In fact, men are the oppressed of society. Feminism is a religion, which is why he took Columbia University to court for violating the First Amendment. That women have intrinsic strengths and weaknesses, strengths being their ability to manipulate men, kind of like Hitchens cunning minxes, and men have an intrinsic strength, bodily strength. And we all know how Roy Hollander ended up. But everything he believed, you find here, you find here, you find here, and you find here. He just took it to its conclusion, even up until his own death. He was a psychological evolutionist. So why are we doing this? Why are we studying this? Josephine, why are we studying this? Josephine? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, we're going towards the Sunday law, and I think we need to know know more about these people that are promoting evolutionary psychology, and we need to understand there's no gendered brain. There is no, if your environment in which you're exposed to and what you're exposed to, we need to, it's after that we need to find out, then we need to ask the question, which one is more superior? And I don't think men are more superior than women, because I had an incident this last week that reminded me of what you've been teaching. Yeah, but maybe I'm going to talk too much, so I'll stop there. A real live one. And it proved that the idea that men are more superior is not true. It's what you're exposed to and opportunities that you have.
You're worried you're going to talk too much, Josephine.
I'm a bit worried. My son was telling me about my older boy.
That's sexist.
Yes, sexism.
I don't think you're going to talk too much. So if you want to tell your story, we're happy to.
I will tell.
Bring that into
Twins, 2 high school students, twins, they're twins, and they're taking driving lessons. And my son said one took the lesson straight after school, and the other one took the lesson at peak hours. So before he went into the lesson, because I was telling him about there's no gendered brain, men aren't any superior than women. And he thought men are cleverer than women. So when he put the students to test, he soon found out that the girl was very observant. She was quick with her reactions. She was a skilled driver as compared to the brother, the twin brother. And then he said, yeah, you know what you told me is quite right. So what I did was I swapped the students and exposed the boy to the peak hours driving, and the girl and the boy came up to par. In other words, he was inferior because of what his environment was like, what he was exposed to. And when he changed, but the girl was superior. So the opposite can work. It's what the men that are exposed to engineering, medical science, all of that, they think they're more superior. But you expose the women to the same thing, and they'll have competition. And we're studying that because of, I think, the Sunday law, what's coming in the Sunday law. We need to be aware of our beliefs and be sure about the gender and the sexism, inequality. I don't know, maybe I'm talking too much, but that's what I think.
Don't say that in my class, Josephine.
No, I won't now.
I don't think
You won't
that
open up anymore.
the women here speak too much. I don't think you speak too much. Happy to hear you. That is a good example. This is what happened with vaccines. People have had an experience, they have a friend, they see a child that develops autism or seems to suddenly develop around the age when it usually manifests, which is around the age they get certain types of vaccines, and they put the two together and think they've formed a conclusion. This is what happens with gender all the time. You put men and women in a certain scenario and it just continues to build upon and validate what was an incorrect premise to start with. The idea that there are these intrinsic differences, strengths and weaknesses, and it does attack this message, the Midnight Cry message, at its very core. Because if you're going to talk about Eden to Eden, and you see that sin created a patriarchal system, and we see the patriarchal system needs to be dismantled, then Daniel Dennett is going to say, this wasn't sin, this is biology. Dennett says it's not sin, it's biology. It's incompatible with the message of gender equality. If men have a biological, an intrinsic strength for rational argument, for leadership, then there's nothing wrong with, and again, they will say that this is general, this is average, it's just most women can't be good leaders, not all, so don't be offended. It does make you look at society and see that there's nothing wrong with the lack of women representation in Parliament or in Congress. It makes you look at Hillary Clinton and not see the sexism that she's endured. It makes you not see the sexism in her defeat. It makes you not see the sexism in the attacks she came under. It makes you question the strength that she was able to exhibit. This argument, this psychological evolutionist argument, is incompatible with a message built on equality being the original and equality being what it should be. I want to come back and ask some more people though, why we are studying this. Because why do we care what Daniel Dennett thinks? Some of us might not have even known that Daniel Dennett existed before we started studying this. We only have a limited amount of time, so why are we studying this? Molly.
The way I look at and understand the article is that as we're heading towards Sunday law, we can see the sexism against women in workforce is being suppressed, and men always try to suppress women in all parts. Even though they know that, that the study and the facts doesn't approve what they're saying. They're doing it in a scientific way, but but the women are compatible in everything that we do, and we are equal. They are equal to us in a lot of things that they are doing, even in scientific area, in tech universities, and that there are higher percentage of women they are qualified, but the men are still trying to suppress them as we're heading towards Sunday law, because sexism is developing, which lead to a hatred of women as we get closer to Sunday law.
So you said a lot of good things. If I was to summarize it, that it's here to teach us about sexism in society, and you said even in, maybe if I wrote STEM instead of science, does that embody what you were saying, Molly?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Greg?
I've got my earpods in, so let me know if it's a problem. First of all, I see the article, you kind of had it written on the board, but you rubbed it out where Cynthia was saying one thing and Delmore was saying something else. And it stood out that there was two streams of information quite clearly. Obviously, Delmore was using, in my opinion, a pseudoscience. And Cynthia, I can't remember, Lee, I think her name was, she was actually discussing how his stream of information was actually not correct. And I think this, and she pointed out that and you wrote on the board that they use reason and science. To me, it stood out like, if I want to write an article, I can pull information together to make it seem like that I am reasonable and logical and using science. But then someone else, and I can prove my point that you should use this product A because product A is the best product. And here's the science to prove it. And I just happen to make product A. But then someone can come along and say, well, even though you say product A is this, you are biased to product A. And in actual fact, if you look at the science behind it, therefore, product A is not logical and the best way to go and makes the best sense. You have written it with a bias, and you, Josephine mentioned about the way we're brought up, the way we see things. Obviously, it's our bias. So Delmore obviously has a very strong bias, and it's come from Darwinism, from science. And I think the patriarchal system, as you said, in science has made us believe that the patriarchal system of sin is science and is psychological and biological, when in actual fact, it's not. And the only way you can prove it's not is by listening to another stream of science. But of course, because of bias, you negate and reject the correct stream of information.
So we've looked at two streams of information within Adventism, within Protestantism, going back to 1798. We've done that for Catholicism, and now we've gone to science and seen the two streams of information within science. Whenever you go to a different group, those who support the position of sexism are always pretty much always the leadership. It's always the institutional. I would even say that for Catholicism now, even though Francis is in some ways embodied, represented both sides, we can make two compare and contrasts with Pope Francis and Catholicism. So you're going to say that it's to show us the two streams of information in science, the bias that exists that they are not immune to, because that Google employee, he used a lot of science, and a lot of evolutionary psychologists said the science is with him, and in this fight between the two sides, the evolutionary psychologists are winning. That is not something that Gina Rippon would agree with, and we agree with her. We agree with her not just because her arguments are fantastic, but because that is what prophecy teaches us. Brodie.
Answering the question about why we want to know or understand this better, I think I, we're learning to refocus. So in the early stages of focusing on feminism and the patriarchy, we were looking at it from the perspective of Christianity, and then broadening to religion. And we're learning to refocus to look at where sexism sits globally. And that means we have to reevaluate the cause, or at least consider its origin. So, is the patriarchy from our patriarchs, Abraham or Moses or Christianity, or does it go deeper?
So we're looking outside of Christianity now. We're seeing that it is a global issue, common to not just in the context of the United States, the evangelical dominionists and the Mount Rushmore of modern atheism, but it exists in the descendants of Confucianism in China. It exists through Hinduism in India. It exists through Islam in Saudi Arabia. It exists through the Judeo-Christian West within Russia. Where does this come from? So we're refocusing on global sexism, and when we look globally outside of our Adventist bubbles, it forces us to reevaluate the cause of sexism, the cause of gender discrimination and abuse. Brendan, why are we doing this?
I think it's now that we're I agree with what everyone's just said. We're now living in a post-Christian environment. And so I guess the direct opposition to this movement would be what we're looking at, I would think. And that's the threat. So I guess that's that. I think we're now looking at the cause of the underlying cause of a lot of the sexism that we find in society. And for me, particularly with that article, if you go back to the original two streams where I think it was Caroline, in the 1880s, women's rights activist, her name was Caroline Kennard, when she wrote to Darwin directly, you could see the seed right there. What her argument was, well, and it's exactly what Josephine said, let the environment of women be similar to that of men and with the same opportunities that he has, before you can judge and make the claims you're making, and to suggest they're intellectually inferior. So right back then, the arguments were the same. On one side, you've got Darwin saying it's a natural state of affairs because this is how it is. This is the biases that exist in nature, and she's saying it's environmental, and it's the inequality of society making that, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which then people use as evidence that, see, Darwin is right time and time again. So because of the inequality, it gives less opportunity for women to do certain things, and it just perpetuates and perpetuates, and people use that as even evidence for their claims. So why are we looking at this? I think it's the biggest threat. Particularly in the post-Christian world.
To see the threat to true equality,
Feminism, yeah.
feminism.
To radical feminism. It's like the underlying threat. And it seems so. Yes, it keeps saying reasonable if you adhere to all those that I'm going to call Darwinism, that ideology. If you adhere to that, you can see why you know millions of people are just going to be stuck there. I'm not sure how else to say why.
So we're seeing where society is stuck, secular society.
Yeah.
And how that creates an impenetrable blockage to true proper gender equality. That's what I heard you say in the last portion anyway.
Well, if it's a natural state of affairs, it's not seen as a threat because that's just how it is. So everyone accept their place.
Remember, there's no God, there's no sin, there is no true moral compass of right and wrong. However unpleasant, differences are if I can use a famous phrase, the natural order of things. And it's irrational to fight that. Josephine.
I find it interesting listening to your story about when Pamela came to Australia and how you pushed among the men to ask questions or to inquire. I think that's happened to me before with other speakers. And you soon become, this was before I got into this message, you sort of got a bit sensitive because you're the only woman. Why are you with these men? And that
it
kind
looks
of,
bad.
Yeah. But I think if you want to be up there, you want to be equal with them, you got to be out there, like in your case, asking questions, learning what you need to learn, finding out what other people think of the topic or what the lecturer has to say more. And I'm glad that you put me up about me not talking too much, because that's the way sometimes we think as women, I've said too much, maybe I should keep quiet. When a man usually doesn't say that. They don't make excuses even though they talk too much, I think, at times. But we tend to put that forward, and I think I'm not going to have regrets next time. But I thought that's very, very interesting, because I've had experience similar to you even before this time.
It's always a fight.
Yes.
It takes mental, emotional energy to not stay in the portion of your sphere that society, often without even speaking, deems appropriate. And I'm going to quote someone. That will make me wildly unpopular with some people, and for reasons that I will get into at a coming presentation, I won't justify yet. I knew certain things early on without ever having to be told. I knew that men have the power physically, socially and financially, and that a lot of institutions support that arrangement. I knew this long before I had the words to articulate it, and I bet you learnt it young too. So you knew, Josephine, you knew young that women talk too much, and therefore you should talk less. And when, again, like the gendered brain, if you actually want to look at the data, women speak less than men, and I've shared that on the media broadcast before, trying to undercut some of those stereotypes, but they are so ingrained. And for those wondering, I just quoted Amber Heard, and we will be discussing her more.